Steve is a biologist with over 30 years of experience working with Ontario Power Generation, as a former Ontario Hydro. He's currently Senior Advisor of Sustainable Development at Ontario Power Generation. Steve's career path has included environmental policy development, implementation, environmental assessments, and applied environmental research, where his work focuses specifically on the effects of forest fragmentation on wildlife. He was responsible for the development and implementation of a biodiversity policy, the first of its kind for an electrical industry. He has made many contributions to woodland conservation in southern Ontario. Steve currently works in the Corporate Sustainable Development Group of Ontario Power Generation, where he manages their biodiversity programs and its carbon sequestration programs and biodiversity management programs. A busy man. Steve is also a past president of the Ontario Nature, which is formerly a Federation of Ontario Naturalists, and is a founding member and past director of Natural Step Canada, an organization dedicated to promoting sustainability across society. Steve's talk is Ontario's Biodiversity Strategy, Protecting What Sustains Us.
Okay, thank you, John. Last spot of the afternoon and up against the cash bar. Not the place to be in. Anyway, I will do my best to try to keep you engaged. Thanks very much to Judy and the organizing committee for inviting me to this event. It's a great event. So I'm going to be talking about the state of Ontario's biodiversity and the growing threats to its impairment. I'm going to juxtapose that reality against a renewed Ontario biodiversity strategy to better protect what sustains us, which really is the focus of my talk. I'm also going to briefly speak to some suggested high-level priorities for action that I think we must address to curtail further losses and to move us towards a healthier and more ecologically sustainable future. Okay, now redundancy of message, which hopefully will actually reinforce some of the key themes here, is obvious. We've been all talking about the same stuff. So biodiversity, as you've heard, it refers to the variety of life on Earth. It's ecosystems, the diversity of species found within those ecosystems, and the genetic diversity found within species, and the ecological and evolutionary processes which keep them functioning yet ever evolving. And as we've also heard, biodiversity means a whole lot more than just assemblages of species and ecosystem. It also includes the functions and the services that those ecosystems provide. Such services as clean water to drink, clean air to breathe, healthy food to eat, and renewable raw materials upon which our economy and society depends. But it also includes key services which are not directly valued in the marketplace, such as regulating services for climate regulation and water flow, as well as supporting services such as pollination and soil formation, services upon which we absolutely depend. Failure to formally value these services has contributed to their global degradation and their demise. We need to address that issue, and we need to do it soon, or we will see even further losses. So that's sort of point number one. Okay, why conserve? Again, you've heard. There's obviously the altruistic, the moral imperative. Surely the rest of life matters. I don't think anybody in this room would disagree with that. That doesn't necessarily resonate with everybody, however. There's also a second and perhaps even more compelling reason that would touch perhaps more people, and that is one of enlightened self-interest for the clean air, the water, the food, and the renewable resources that our ecosystems provides, those ecosystem services again. Now, I think in terms of enlightened self-interest, G. Diamond says it rather well, and so I'm going to quote him. He says, human needs in a healthy environment are not opposing claims that must be balanced. Instead, they are inexorably linked through chains of cause and effect. We need a healthy environment because we need clean water, clean air, wood and food, plus soil and sunlight to grow our crops. We need functioning natural ecosystems with their native species of earthworms, bees, plants, and microbes to generate and aerate our soils, pollinate our crops, decompose our waste, and produce our oxygen. We need to prevent toxic substances from accumulating in our water, air, and soil. We need to prevent weeds, germs, and other pest species from becoming established in places where they are not native and where they can cause economic damage. Our strongest arguments for a healthy environment, meaning biodiversity, are selfish. We need it for ourselves, not just for threatened species. Somehow, in my view, we need to convey that reality, that fundamental message, to the masses, to the populace. For without their support, losses will likely continue. Now, we would not be here today talking about biodiversity if all was well with life on Earth. Biodiversity and its associated ecosystem services are in a state of decline globally, nationally, and provincially. The threats to biodiversity, and you've already heard about this, are driven by a growing human population and ever-increasing levels of resource consumption, meaning unsustainable human activity. They can be conveniently described by the acronym HIPPO and in pretty much that order of priority, meaning habitat loss, still the greatest threat. We've heard about that. Exotic invasive species. Population growth, which continues to fuel all these other threats. Pollution. Overharvesting, still a huge global threat, less so here in the province because species are regulated. Nevertheless, it's still a problem for some species that are at risk. And now we have climate change. Now my guess, and it's not much of a guess here, is that in the coming years and decades, climate change may well eclipse all of those other threats. In fact, it will have a multiplier effect and accelerator effect on those other threats. We need to start linking these two key global issues, biodiversity and climate change, as they are intertwined both in terms of cause and effect, as well as in terms of solutions going forward. And I suspect we'll be hearing more about that again tonight. Indeed, I would suggest that the acronym HIPPO will probably be changed soon to being CHIPPO, with climate change being priority number 1 in terms of threat. Okay. As mentioned, in the case of Ontario, one of the driving forces for the drawdown of our natural capital, meaning our living biodiversity, is our insatiable consumption of resources, otherwise known as our ecological footprint. The ecological footprint compares human demands on nature with the available biocapacity to provide the products that we consume and to absorb the carbon waste that we emit. It is very much a macro indicator of overarching human pressures which are causing biodiversity losses. Now, Ontario's ecological footprint at 8.5 global hectares per person is equivalent to its current biocapacity, and that is based on the productive capacity of the entire province. Now, if we were to narrow that down to where the vast majority of us live, which is in southern Ontario, we would be exceeding the biocapacity of that region by an order of about 6-fold. And that assessment, by the way, grossly actually underestimates what is actually needed to conserve the rest of biodiversity. It is very much an anthropocentric construct looking at services and products that we can get out of biodiversity for our own use and our own use exclusively. And remember, Ontario is growing with another predicted 4 million people coming in the province over the next couple of decades. We are already at the limits of our biocapacity provincially, well beyond for the southern part of the province. A little bit more in terms of our ecological footprint. Ontario's ecological footprint is the 4th largest recorded in the entire world. There are only 3 other countries which have a per capita footprint larger than the average Ontarian. They are the United Arab Emirates, the United States of America, and Kuwait. Well, that puts us in some pretty distinguished company, but I would say not proudly so. If everyone in the world lived a comparable lifestyle to us in terms of resource consumption, it would require the capacity of 4 planets to deliver those resources to a planet of 7 billion people. We have only 1 planet. The point is this: globally, we are living off the principle, our global savings account, not the interest. We have been in a mode of deficit spending of our natural capital since the mid-1980s. That, of course, does not bode well for nature or for humanity. Remember, as was shown earlier, our living planet index, our global living planet index is declining. It's tanking at the same time that our ecological footprint is growing the other direction. We need to live within the means of nature. By the way, Ontario will be producing a living planet index for itself as a subset. I promise. In terms of pressures on biodiversity, it should come as no surprise that the pressures are most acute in southern Ontario and the lower Great Lakes, which also supports Canada's densest population of people and also supports more species at risk than any other region within Canada. Habitat loss and fragmentation, as I've already mentioned, is the greatest threat. Climate change risk is greatest in the far north, but that does not exempt southern Ontario from its effects. We live in a highly fragmented system, which makes it particularly vulnerable as habitats start to change because of climate change. In terms of the state of Ontario's biodiversity, there are no indicators of biodiversity response which are showing consistent improvement. Some indicators are showing mixed results, stable in some areas, improving in other areas, and deteriorating in other areas, not surprising given the vastness of the province. Forests, for example, in southern Ontario are rebounding. They're up to close to 25% from a low of about 11% back in the 1920s. But certainly not everywhere. If you live in southwestern Ontario, there are counties with less than 5% forest cover. And by the way, 25% is still not where we need to be. It should be a minimum of 30% and ideally 50% or more to conserve biodiversity and provide healthy ecosystems with the services that we aspire to. Other habitats also show continued deterioration, such as wetland loss in southern Ontario, now at 72%, up from 68% in spite of having a wetlands policy for the last 20 years. And the list, of course, goes on. Now, as you've heard, in terms of biodiversity, again, all is not well diversity, all levels, globally right through to provincially. That is why we have a Convention on Biological Diversity. And that is why we and the various signatories to the convention were busy in 2010 reporting on the state of biodiversity. Those national reports were summarized into the Global Biodiversity Outlook Report 3 and made it painfully clear that we have failed to achieve our global targets of slowing down the rate of biodiversity loss. By the way, that same thing holds true for Canada. It also holds true for Ontario. There remains much to be done to turn this Titanic around. In October 2010, the nations of the world that signed on to the convention in Nagoya met in Nagoya to hammer out a 10-year strategic plan for action to save biodiversity and to enhance its benefits for people. Remember, we've already had a biodiversity convention for the last 20 years. That plan includes some 5 goals and some 20 targets known as the ACHI targets to focus our global activities. Now, Canada to date has been doing its part, and I hope is in the process of developing a new plan of action to achieve those global and hence national targets, known as the ACHI targets. Now, given recent federal events, I am very anxious to see just how Canada will respond. Indeed, we have to remember we have a legal responsibility to act. We need to keep our government accountable to act and not retreat from its global responsibilities. Now, Ontario has also been busy trying to conserve biodiversity and to protect what sustains us. In 2005, the province released its Ontario Biodiversity Strategy, Protecting What Sustains Us, and subsequently formed the Ontario Biodiversity Council, a multi-stakeholder group to help oversee its implementation, which is also supported by a few other key groups, the Stewardship Network of Ontario and the Biodiversity Education and Awareness Network and the Science Forum. The council, by the way, is comprised of volunteers from environmental groups, from academia, from government, including Aboriginal organizations, as well as from industry. The Minister of Natural Resources sits on council as the government representative. M&R also provides much needed support through its Biodiversity Secretariat under Alla Boyd, and they've done a great job. Now, the last few years has been very busy for council and for the Biodiversity Secretariat. 2010, the International Year of Biodiversity, saw the delivery of several key products from council, including the State of Biodiversity Report 2010 and the Highlights Report, the Ontario Biodiversity Strategy Progress Report, a progress report looking at what we've actually accomplished in the preceding 5 years, and the first ever report on Ontario's ecological footprint. Now, some of this material can actually be found at the booth down the hall here. And last June 2011, just about a year ago, the Ontario Biodiversity Council released its new Ontario Biodiversity Strategy at the Brickworks in Toronto. For the first half of the year, the renewal team that I chaired, with support of the M&R's Biodiversity Secretariat, were engaging a wide array of stakeholders and expert groups trying to renew the biodiversity strategy and forge a new path forwards. It was very much an engaging and transparent process that I think provided some rather enlightening insights. Ontario's Biodiversity Strategy 2011 is all about renewing our commitment to protecting what sustains us. It is very much a blueprint for an ecologically sustainable future for Ontario that aligns rather well with the Convention on Biological Diversity's strategic plan and ACHI targets. Our vision is noble, and by necessity it is also broad, serving the needs of nature and perhaps more fundamentally ourselves, recognizing that our future prosperity and indeed our health is totally dependent upon sustaining that vast matrix that we are calling biodiversity. Our vision is a future where biodiversity loss is actually halted and recovery is advanced. People value, they protect, and they enhance biodiversity and the ecosystem services which are essential for our human health, well-being, and for our economic prosperity. Now, in that vision, people actually get it. We are a part of nature, we are not apart from nature. We need to reconnect with nature. We need to start protecting what actually does sustain us and our economy. We've also refined and we've restated our goals. They now include 3 high-level goals, with the first goal being mainstreaming biodiversity across all sectors, consistent with the first goal coming out of the Convention on Biological Diversity Strategic Plan. The second 2 goals continued from the original strategy, protecting, restoring, and recovering Ontario's genetic, species, and ecosystem diversity and its related functions and processes. And thirdly, using Ontario's biological assets sustainably. Ecological and hence social and economic sustainability really is the imperative here. We've also refined our 7 strategic directions of the original strategy into 4 directives, something that you just might remember. They include, first, engaging people, so that we all understand the imperative of conserving biodiversity and more fundamentally, our absolute dependence upon biodiversity and its services. Secondly, reducing threats, so that Ontarians' use of resources and the pressures that we exert on biodiversity is well within the capacity of our ecosystems to sustain such uses and such pressures. And thirdly, enhancing resilience, so that our ecosystems, our biodiversity, can better cope with our cumulative impacts, including the ever-increasing effects that climate change will exert. And finally, improving knowledge, so that we can better track the state of Ontario's biodiversity, in turn, better engage people, better reduce threats, and better enhance ecosystem resilience. There is a real and purposeful notion of adaptive management in this framework, as well as continual improvement, a real learning process to achieve our vision and our goals. Each of those strategic directions is supported by long-term objectives, desired outcomes, and some 39 key actions, which will serve to help focus our efforts as we mainstream biodiversity across all sectors of society. And this time we've actually established targets, something we did not have in the original strategy. Some 15 measurable, time-bound targets for tracking our success towards achieving our objectives and our outcomes. As they say, what gets measured gets managed. Well, we shall see. We're going to put that to the test. I hope that happens. Now, I know you can't read these targets, but you can find them in the brochure that's actually part of your summit package. Our strategy is also a 10-year strategy, consistent with the 10-year International Strategic Plan, which came out of the Convention on Biological Diversity. We believe a 10-year plan is reasonable. We did not get into the situation we got into overnight, nor are we about to reverse it overnight. It is going to take time. We need to have some milestones, we need to have traction, and we need to move forward. And we need to be adaptive. Learn as we implement our strategy. Accordingly, we will be monitoring and reporting our progress against our actions and our targets on a 5-year basis, with the next State of Biodiversity report and the next progress report coming out in 2015. The strategy also tries to identify some very broad roles and responsibilities for various groups that could help in the implementation process. So, to recap, we have a vision for an ecologically sustainable future, and we have a plan, complete with goals, objectives, strategic directions, and some 39 actions to help get us from where we are to where we want to be. To achieve that vision, we will need a profound cultural shift in how we interact with nature and how we measure progress. We need to reconnect with that sustains us. Engaging people, the masses, to me, is a critical part of that effort. Now, I'd like to offer a few thoughts on implementation. The Council alone cannot possibly deliver the scale of change that is required to conserve Ontario's biodiversity. As I have previously said, what we need is nothing short of a social movement towards an ecologically sustainable society. We need to instill a sense of urgency for action, or we will lose much and we will pay the price ourselves. And we need to have some champions who can show the way. We've heard from some today. Our renewed strategy provides a broad framework and a roadmap for action for the next decade, but it is not an exhaustive list. There's even more that can be done. Now, as I see it, the biodiversity issue is today with society where pollution was back in the early 1960s. Recall the work of Rachel Carson and Silent Spring. That forced society and it forced industry back on its heels. They have since had to grapple with it. They now have regulations. Every major industry now is involved with pollution abatement and more fundamentally prevention of pollution. We need to do the very same thing with biodiversity, and we need to fast track it over the next 5 years, not wait for 40 years to have it as part of our culture. I would also suggest that governments cannot do it alone. NGOs cannot do it alone, and neither can business. All sectors need to be engaged, and that even cascades down to each and every one of us as individuals. We need to remember that we as consumers and as voters are very much in the driver's seat. We need to take control of that. We need to act responsibly. We need to send votes to those who are willing to deliver, and we need to purchase products that are more sustainable, that are more green. And we anxiously await the government's response to the strategy. In terms of our view, that is Council's views, we are expecting that the government, not just the Ministry of Natural Resources, will lead by example and will work to achieve their own implementation plan in support of the strategy and indeed the ACHI targets to protect what sustains us. If we are to mainstream society, our biodiversity across all sectors, then I would suggest that government will need to take a lead role. Remember, the government does have a clear role to protect what is in the broader public interest. Protecting what sustains us is clearly in the public interest. And Council is also busy working on its own implementation plan, which builds around the formation of working groups where we've had the greatest success in actually getting things done. In addition to Bean and Snow, the Stewardship Network of Ontario, we proposed a series of new working groups to advance the strategy. Working groups such as a Human Health and Biodiversity Working Group, advancing the linkages between healthy ecosystems and healthy people. A new Business and Biodiversity Work Group, mainstreaming biodiversity across all sectors of business and industry. An Ontario Public Service Biodiversity Network of high-level folks within the ministries working to ensure it is mainstreamed within all ministries. A Natural Capital Working Group, advancing the valuation of ecosystem services which currently have no monetary value, and developing economic incentives for their conservation and restoration. A Natural Heritage Conservation and Protected Areas work group, developing integrated landscape approaches to biodiversity conservation that will achieve resilience as well to climate change impacts. And an Urban Biodiversity Work Group, advancing the development of urban biodiversity strategies and increasing awareness of biodiversity in the populous in the centers of population within the province, where we need fundamental support. Okay, one of the strengths of the strategy is its breadth. Things we must do to help achieve our goals and vision. That breadth, as I mentioned, translates into some 39 actions, which, by the way, can also be regarded as a weakness, particularly in times of economic constraint, which is where we are at right now as a province. Accordingly, many of us feel we need to set some high-level priorities, things that we must do if we are to curb biodiversity losses and achieve a healthier future for biodiversity and for ourselves. Accordingly, I'd like to offer the following game changers, if you will, where if we do not make notable progress, we will be sitting here 10 years from now lamenting even further losses. 1. Making the link between human health and ecosystem health. Are we investing in the right areas to ensure that we have healthy ecosystems that will have healthy people? Secondly, development of incentives for the delivery of ecosystem services, particularly those with no current monetary value. The economy needs to be aligned with ecology and ecological limits. Until we solve that problem, we will continue to see losses. Promoting habitat offsets and conservation making with developers and with industry. They need to start being engaged in this whole effort. Reducing habitat loss, linking biodiversity to climate change, both in terms of mitigation as well as adaptation. We need integrated plans and responses. Reducing habitat loss through more effective land use planning. And finally, improving and disseminating knowledge so we know whether we're winning or whether we're losing the game, meaning meaningful monitoring. Now, we are not without our challenges. The last thing we want is yet another strategy gathering dust on the shelf. Implementation is absolutely key. Move too slow and losses will outpace action. Move too quickly and we risk backlash from vested interests. The key threat, as I see it right now, is the lack of financial and resource commitment to implement. That is as much a function, I would suggest, of a general social malaise, a profound disconnection of most people from their dependence upon biodiversity for every aspect of their lives. That, of course, translates into an absence of political will to respond to the strategy. We need to remember we elect the governments which serve us. Do we, as the electorate, have our priorities right? Are we sending the right messages to government? More specifically, I would suggest that provincial economic woes, read the Drummond report, could adversely affect funding and resourcing of critical programs at a time when we need much greater support, not less support. Financial woes, in my view, need to be placed within a much broader context. That is, the deficit spending and the drawdown of global and indeed provincial natural capital. We need to balance our natural capital accounts every bit as much as we need to balance our financial accounts. And remember, Ontario is growing. So my question to you is, do we have our priorities right? And I would also suggest, first comes the values, then comes the science and the technology, and then the public and hence political will to implement. We need to get our values right. So, what's needed? These are my views. In broad strokes, what is needed is nothing short, in my view, of a new social movement which reconnects us with nature. Big problems demand big solutions. Past and current market drivers have shaped the landscape, often to the detriment of nature. Future market drivers must be restorative, and they must align with the economy and ecology within ecological limits. Stated differently, we cannot solve the big problems of today using the same approaches which got us into that problem. Accordingly, to achieve healthy, resilient ecosystems, we need a step change in conservation action and a societal push for ecological sustainability. We need contagious commitment on this issue. Ontario's biodiversity strategy needs to be seen as a vehicle to move us towards a more sustainable future. This is not a nice to do, in my view. This is very much an imperative for us to do. The bottom line is this. Healthy ecosystems sustain healthy people and sustain a healthy and prosperous economy. We need to look after the resource base, our healthy ecosystems. We must protect what sustains us. Okay, last slide. The Ontario Biodiversity Strategy is all about our collective future and protecting what sustains us. Ontario's Biodiversity Strategy 2011 is our new call to action and our roadmap to safeguard Ontario's genetic, species, and ecosystem diversity for this generation and for all generations to come. We ask that you read it. We ask that you internalize its message. We ask that you too become a participant in its implementation. In conclusion, I think this quote from E.O. Wilson pretty much says it all. Surely the rest of life matters. Surely our stewardship is its only hope. We will be wise to listen carefully to the heart, then act with rational intention and all the tools that we can gather to bear. Thank you.
Steve, were you at the invasive species workshop in Toronto recently?
The last one that I was at was probably about a year ago.
Okay, so I heard a really great alternative to the HIPPO acronym when I was there last. And because I usually kind of have traditionally put climate change as underneath the pollution, but when you look at it as more of a synergistic thing across all those categories, the 5 drivers in the HIPPO acronym kind of collectively contribute more or less, depending which one, to climate change. What they had proposed is the next letter in that acronym is an S for synergistic effects, and I think that HIPPOs conveys a much more kind of ominous message compared to one HIPPO, and I just thought I would throw that out there as a potential next acronym. The other thing I wanted to comment on...
I still like
CHIPPO. The thing about the game changers.
Yep.
And the connection between human health and ecosystem health and structure and function. I've been spending 6 years, because of my own personal journey, actually applying what I learned at Waterloo about ecosystem restoration and rehabilitation to human health, making the ecosystem scale the individual human. And I found it really, really easy to apply restoration science to human health and well-being through using things like nutrients and metabolites as your indicators, and healthy controls, which exists all over the evidence-based nutrition research as your reference undisturbed ecosystems. It's really, really awesome. And if anyone in here, if we're talking about Act Now, and if anyone in here has connections to like healthcare, and you can find me at thisisms.com, and I've got piles of science backing up that idea of people as ecosystems so they can identify with the broader world.
A couple comments. I agree with you. The issue of linking ecosystem health to human health has been around for a while. Trees Ontario just released a report exactly on that. So if you look at the Trees Ontario website, you will find a report which tries to link healthy ecosystems to a healthy living, to healthy people, and there's certainly going to be a number of things on conferences in that regard in the coming year, including Laternal. Now, one other thing you mentioned about that, I've often used another slide which I didn't have time to use here, and that is looking at the human body as a metaphor for an ecosystem. And it's interesting, when it comes to protected areas planning, we talk about a target of 12% protected areas, and now it's moved up to 17% thanks to the strategic plan through Nagoya. Now think about it for a moment. We could live without our limbs, we could live without our sight, we could live without our hearing, we could live with one lung, we could live with one kidney. But would anybody look to that as being something that they would aspire to have? I don't think so. So when we start talking about parceling up, protected areas as if that's enough, we know it isn't. That's why connectivity, that's why looking at landscape context is so critically important. We are a part of nature, not apart from it.